For 25 years, Frank Rodriguez had walked the same postal route through Maple Grove neighborhood, delivering mail with the reliability of sunrise. Everyone knew him, the friendly mailman with the scarred face who always had a kind word and never missed a delivery. Until the day 8-year-old Emma Peterson asked the question no adult had ever been brave enough to ask. "Mr. Frank, what happened to your face?" The answer would reveal that their beloved mailman wasn't just someone who delivered letters. He was someone who had once delivered wounded soldiers from a burning helicopter in Iraq. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of service, sacrifice, and the courage to ask difficult questions, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe heroes walk among us every day, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. At 6:30 a.m. every weekday morning, Frank Rodriguez began his postal route through the Maple Grove neighborhood of suburban Phoenix, Arizona. At 57, he moved with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had been walking the same streets for over 2 decades, carrying mail to 347 homes and businesses that had become as familiar to him as his own address. Frank knew everyone on his route, not just their names and addresses, but their stories. He knew when the Johnson family was expecting their 3rd child because he'd been delivering baby magazines and medical appointments. He knew when elderly Mrs. Patterson was having health problems because her prescription deliveries had increased. He knew when the Martinez teenagers were applying to colleges because of the thick envelopes that arrived from universities across the country. This wasn't just professional thoroughness. Frank genuinely cared about the people he served. He'd been known to hold packages for families when they were traveling, to call the post office when someone's mail hadn't been picked up for several days, and to remember birthdays of children who always ran to meet him at the mailbox. What everyone also knew about Frank was that he had distinctive facial scarring, burn marks and skin grafts that covered the left side of his face and neck. The scars were old, well-healed, and had clearly been there for decades. They gave Frank a somewhat intimidating appearance at first glance, but anyone who interacted with him quickly discovered that his gentle demeanor and warm personality made the scars irrelevant. In 25 years of delivering mail in Maple Grove, no one had ever asked Frank about his scars. Adults had learned, through social conditioning and politeness, not to comment on physical differences. Children occasionally stared, but their parents would quickly redirect their attention, teaching them that it was rude to ask personal questions about someone's appearance. Frank preferred it that way. He'd built a life around being known for what he did rather than what had happened to him. His identity was as Frank the Mailman, reliable, friendly, always ready to help, rather than as someone defined by past trauma or injury. But what the residents of Maple Grove didn't know was that Frank Rodriguez had once been Staff Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, United States Army, 82nd Airborne Division. That the same hands that now sorted mail and delivered packages had once performed life-saving medical procedures on wounded soldiers under enemy fire. That the scars on his face were souvenirs from the day he'd pulled 7 soldiers from a burning helicopter in Iraq, saving their lives while sustaining injuries that ended his military career. Frank had served 2 tours in Iraq as a flight medic, specializing in combat search and rescue operations. His job had been to accompany helicopter crews on missions to extract wounded soldiers from battlefield situations, providing medical care during transport, and ensuring that injured personnel received immediate treatment that could mean the difference between life and death. It was dangerous work that required both medical expertise and combat training. Flight medics like Frank operated in some of the most hostile environments of the war, flying into areas where enemy fire was expected and where the margin for error was measured in seconds. Frank had been good at his job, so good that he'd been recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the military's highest decorations for aerial heroism. But he'd never talked about that part of his life with his postal customers. As far as they were concerned, he was just Frank the Mailman, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Emma Peterson was 8 years old, in 3rd grade, and possessed the kind of fearless curiosity that made her both a delight and a challenge to the adults in her life. She asked questions about everything: Why the sky was blue, where babies came from, why some people looked different from others, with the directness that only children could manage. Emma lived with her grandmother, Patricia Peterson, in a small house near the end of Frank's route. Patricia was 73, had lived in Maple Grove for 40 years, and had watched Frank deliver mail since he'd started work in the neighborhood. She'd always appreciated his reliability and kindness, especially during the years when her health had been declining, and she'd depended on him to help with packages that were too heavy for her to manage. Emma had been fascinated by Frank since she was old enough to notice him. She loved running to meet him at the mailbox, hearing about the interesting mail he'd delivered to other houses, always maintaining privacy, of course, and listening to his stories about the neighborhood's history. Frank had a gift for making even routine mail delivery sound like an adventure. But Emma had also been curious about Frank's scars from the first time she'd seen them. Her grandmother had taught her not to stare and not to ask personal questions about people's appearance, but the curiosity had never gone away. She'd spent years wondering what had happened to Frank, creating elaborate theories in her imagination about accidents or adventures that might have caused such distinctive scarring. The question finally came on a Tuesday morning in October when Frank was delivering a package to the Peterson house. Emma had been waiting by the mailbox, as she often did before school, and had been chatting with Frank about her upcoming Halloween costume. "Mr. Frank," Emma said suddenly, with the abrupt topic change that characterized 8-year-old conversation, "what happened to your face?" Frank paused, his hand still holding the package he'd been about to give to Emma. The question he'd been expecting for 25 years had finally been asked, not by an adult who might have couched it in careful diplomatic language, but by a child who simply wanted to know. Patricia Peterson appeared at the front door at that moment, having heard Emma's question from inside the house. "Emma," Patricia said sharply, "that's not a polite question to ask." Frank looked at Emma's curious, innocent face, then at Patricia's embarrassed expression. For a moment, he considered giving the deflective answer he'd prepared for this situation, something about an old accident that wasn't worth discussing. Instead, he surprised himself by kneeling down to Emma's eye level and saying, "That's okay, Mrs. Peterson. It's a fair question." He looked directly at Emma, whose attention was completely focused on him. "I got these scars in Iraq," Frank said simply. "I was a soldier, and I was helping other soldiers who had been hurt. There was a helicopter crash, and I got burned while I was pulling people out of the helicopter so they wouldn't die." Emma's eyes widened, not with fear or disgust, but with amazement. "You saved people?" she asked. "I did my job," Frank replied. "That's what soldiers do. We take care of each other." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her. "Are you still a soldier?" she asked. "No, I'm not. I got hurt too badly to keep being a soldier, so I became a mailman instead. But I still help people, just in a different way." Emma considered this for a moment. "I think being a mailman is important too," she said. "You bring people happy letters and birthday cards and packages from people who love them." Frank felt something shift in his chest, not pain, but something closer to relief. After 25 years of carrying his story in silence, he'd finally shared it with someone, and the sky hadn't fallen. "That's right," Frank said, standing up and handing Emma the package. Different ways of helping people, but still helping. As Frank continued his route that morning, he realized that Emma's simple question had done something he hadn't expected. It had reminded him that his military service was something to be proud of, not something to hide. Word of Emma's conversation with Frank spread through the neighborhood gradually, not as gossip but as a realization that their mailman had a history they'd never known about. Patricia Peterson, who had initially been embarrassed by her granddaughter's directness, found herself curious about Frank's military service and wondering how much of his story she'd missed over the years. A few days later, when Frank delivered the mail, Patricia approached him at the mailbox. "Frank, I hope you know that Emma didn't mean any harm by her question," Patricia said. "I know she didn't, Mrs. Peterson. Actually, I'm glad she asked. It felt good to tell someone." Patricia hesitated, then said, "If you don't mind me asking, what kind of soldier were you?" "What did you do in Iraq?" Frank looked at Patricia, perhaps recognizing that her interest was genuine rather than merely curious. I was a flight medic, he said. My job was to fly with helicopter crews to pick up wounded soldiers and provide medical care while we transported them to hospitals. That sounds incredibly dangerous. It was, but it was also the most important work I've ever done. When soldiers were hurt and couldn't get to safety on their own, we were the ones who went to get them. Patricia nodded, beginning to understand why Frank's transition to mail delivery might have felt meaningful to him. Both jobs involved going to people who needed help, just under very different circumstances. The scars, Patricia said carefully, were they from when you were helping someone? Frank was quiet for a moment, perhaps deciding how much detail to share. March 15th, 2004, he said finally. We were extracting wounded soldiers from a firefight near Fallujah. The helicopter took enemy fire during the landing and caught fire after we loaded the casualties. The pilot and co-pilot were unconscious, and 7 wounded soldiers were trapped inside. Frank's voice remained steady, but Patricia could see the weight of the memory in his eyes. I had about 3 minutes to get everyone out before the fuel tank exploded. The fire was spreading fast, and some of the soldiers were too badly injured to move on their own. What did you do? What I was trained to do. I went back into the helicopter 7 times, once for each soldier. By the time I got the last man out, my uniform was on fire, and the left side of my face was burned pretty badly. Patricia felt her breath catch. 7 soldiers? 7 soldiers, Frank confirmed. All of them lived. I spent 4 months in military hospitals recovering from the burns, and another 6 months in physical therapy learning to use my left hand properly again. Patricia stared at Frank, trying to reconcile the gentle mailman she'd known for decades with the image of a young soldier running into a burning helicopter to save lives. Frank, that's extraordinary. You're a hero. Frank shook his head. I'm not a hero, Mrs. Peterson. I'm just someone who did his job when it mattered. The real heroes are the soldiers who didn't make it home. Patricia recognized the humility that many veterans displayed when talking about their service, but she also understood that Frank's actions had been far beyond the call of ordinary duty. Did you receive any recognition for what you did? The Distinguished Flying Cross, Frank said. It's for aerial heroism, but the citation is classified, so most people don't know the details. Frank, why haven't you ever talked about this before? Why keep it secret for 25 years? Frank considered the question, perhaps trying to articulate something he'd never had to explain before. Because I didn't want to be defined by one day in Iraq, he said finally. I wanted to be defined by what I did every day after that. Being a mailman, being part of this neighborhood, helping people in ordinary ways, that felt more authentic to who I am now. Patricia nodded, understanding that Frank had chosen service over recognition, continuity over celebrity. But you're still serving, she said. You're still helping people every day. That's the point, Frank replied. The mission didn't end when I left the military. It just changed form. Patricia Peterson's conversation with Frank about his military service had a profound impact on how she saw both Frank and the concept of heroism. Over the following weeks, she found herself sharing Frank's story with close friends and neighbors, not to gossip, but to help others understand the extraordinary person who had been walking among them unrecognized for decades. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who had taken Frank's service for granted suddenly saw him in a completely different light. They began paying attention to the care and dedication he brought to his work, understanding that his reliability and kindness weren't just professional habits. They were expressions of a character that had been forged under extreme circumstances. Mrs. Johnson, whose family had been receiving mail from Frank for 15 years, approached him one morning with tears in her eyes. Frank, Patricia Peterson told me about what you did in Iraq. I just wanted to thank you for your service and to tell you how grateful I am that someone like you has been taking care of our neighborhood all these years. Frank accepted her thanks graciously, but he was clearly uncomfortable with the attention. He'd spent 25 years building an identity based on present actions rather than past achievements, and the sudden focus on his military service felt like a disruption of the peace he'd found. But other neighbors had different reactions. Tom Martinez, whose son was currently serving in Afghanistan, approached Frank with questions about military life and deployment experiences. Frank found himself providing insights and reassurance that only came from someone who had lived through combat deployments. "It helps to talk to someone who understands what deployment means," Tom told Frank. "The other parents in our support group are great, but they haven't been where our kids are going." Frank realized that his military experience, which he'd kept private for so long, might actually be valuable to other military families in the neighborhood. He began opening up more about his service, sharing perspectives that helped parents understand what their deployed children were experiencing. The most significant recognition came from an unexpected source, the local VFW post, which had been trying to locate Frank for years. Commander Bill Stevens, a Vietnam veteran who ran the VFW post, had heard about Frank's story through the neighborhood network and approached him during his mail route. "Frank Rodriguez?" Stevens asked. "Yes, sir." "I'm Bill Stevens, commander of VFW Post 847. We've been looking for you." Frank looked puzzled. "Looking for me? Why?" "Because we have a copy of your Distinguished Flying Cross citation, and we've been trying to track down recipients in the Phoenix area so we can properly honor their service." Stevens pulled out a folded document and handed it to Frank. It was an official copy of his DFC citation, complete with the declassified details of his actions during the helicopter rescue. "Frank, what you did in Iraq, pulling 7 soldiers from a burning helicopter while under enemy fire, that's the kind of heroism that needs to be remembered and honored." Frank read the citation, perhaps seeing the official description of his actions for the first time in years. "Commander Stevens, I appreciate this, but I'm not looking for recognition. I'm just trying to live a quiet life and do useful work." "I understand that," Stevens replied, "but there are young veterans in our community who need to see examples of successful transitions from military to civilian life. You found a way to continue serving while building a meaningful post-military career. That's something other veterans need to hear about." Frank considered this perspective. He'd never thought of his mail route as an example of successful veteran transition, but he could see how other veterans might benefit from understanding that service could continue in civilian careers. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Frank asked. "Would you consider speaking at our monthly meeting? Nothing formal, just sharing your story and talking about how you found purpose after military service?" Frank looked around the neighborhood where he'd worked for 25 years, thinking about the relationships he'd built and the service he'd provided. "Let me think about it," he said. 2 weeks later, Frank Rodriguez stood at the podium in the VFW post-meeting room, looking out at an audience of 40 veterans from conflicts ranging from Vietnam to Afghanistan. It was the first time he'd spoken publicly about his military service, and he was nervous about how to share his story in a way that would be meaningful to other veterans. "My name is Frank Rodriguez," he began. "I served 2 tours in Iraq as a flight medic with the 82nd Airborne. Most of you probably know me as the mailman who delivers mail in the Maple Grove neighborhood." There were nods of recognition from several veterans in the audience. "I got these scars," Frank said, gesturing to his face, "pulling 7 soldiers out of a burning helicopter near Fallujah in 2004. It ended my military career, but it also taught me something important about service." Frank paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I was medically retired, I thought my ability to serve was over. I thought being a soldier was the only way I could make a meaningful contribution. But what I learned over the past 25 years is that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just changes form." He looked around the room, making eye contact with veterans of different ages and from different conflicts. Delivering mail might not seem like much compared to flying rescue missions in Iraq, but every day I connect people to their families, deliver important documents, bring good news and birthday cards and packages from people who love them. I'm still serving people who need help. It's just a different kind of help. Frank's voice became stronger as he continued. "The skills I learned in the military, attention to detail, reliability, caring about the people you serve, those skills transferred to civilian work. The mission to help others, the commitment to being there when people count on you, that didn't change." One veteran in the audience raised his hand. "How did you deal with the transition?" "The change from high-stakes military work to ordinary civilian work? Frank nodded, understanding the question. It wasn't easy at first. I missed the adrenaline, the sense of urgency, the feeling that what I was doing mattered in life or death ways. But gradually, I realized that helping people doesn't have to be dramatic to be important. He gestured toward the audience. Every veteran in this room has skills and experience that can benefit civilian communities. The challenge is finding ways to use those skills in civilian contexts. For me, it was understanding that delivering mail was still about serving others, still about being reliable when people counted on me. Another veteran asked, "Do you ever regret leaving the military? Do you wish you could have continued flying missions?" Frank considered the question carefully. I loved being a flight medic. I loved the work, the team, the sense of purpose. But the scars on my face aren't just from burns. They're a reminder that I was able to save 7 lives that day. Every morning when I look in the mirror, I remember that those 7 soldiers went home to their families because I was there to help them. Frank's voice carried emotion as he continued. I can't fly rescue missions anymore, but I can still serve. I can still be someone people count on. I can still make a difference in my community, just in a different way. The applause was sustained and genuine, but what struck Frank most was the quality of questions that followed his presentation. Veterans asked about finding civilian careers that felt meaningful, about dealing with the psychological adjustment to lower stakes work, about maintaining military values in civilian contexts. Frank realized that his story wasn't just about one man's transition from military to civilian life. It was about the universal challenge that all veterans faced in finding purpose and identity after service. 6 months after Frank's first conversation with Emma Peterson, his life had changed in ways he hadn't expected. He was still walking the same mail route, still delivering letters and packages with the same reliability and care, but his understanding of his work had evolved. Frank had become an informal mentor to other veterans in the Phoenix area, particularly those struggling with the transition to civilian careers. The VFW post had connected him with veterans who were looking for guidance on finding meaningful work after military service, and Frank had discovered that his experience could help others navigate similar challenges. The key, Frank would tell young veterans, is understanding that service doesn't end when you leave the military. It just takes different forms. The question isn't whether you can find work as meaningful as military service. It's whether you can bring military values to whatever work you find. Frank's story had also had an impact on the Maple Grove neighborhood. Residents had developed a deeper appreciation for the service he provided, not because they knew about his military background, but because they understood the care and dedication he brought to his work every day. Emma Peterson, whose innocent question had started everything, had become Frank's unofficial assistant on days when she didn't have school. She would walk part of his route with him, helping to sort mail and learning about the neighborhood's history from someone who had been observing it for 25 years. "Mr. Frank," Emma said one morning as they walked together, "do you think I could be a soldier when I grow up?" Frank looked down at the 8-year-old girl who had changed his life with a simple question. "You could be," he said. "But remember that there are lots of ways to serve people. Soldiers, doctors, teachers, police officers, firefighters, even mailmen. The important thing is finding work that helps others and doing it with all your heart." Emma nodded seriously, as if she were storing this advice for future reference. "I think I might want to be a mailman like you," she said. "You make people happy when you bring them letters from people they love." Frank smiled, understanding that Emma had grasped something that many adults missed, that ordinary work could be extraordinarily meaningful when it was performed with care and dedication. Later that week, Frank received a letter that would have amused him if he'd been in a position to appreciate the irony. It was from the Department of Veterans Affairs, informing him that he'd been selected to receive a commendation for his work with transitioning veterans in the Phoenix area. The letter noted that Frank's continued commitment to service in civilian life exemplifies the values and dedication that define American military service, and invited him to a ceremony where he would be recognized along with other veterans who had made significant contributions to their communities. Frank read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his uniform pocket. 25 years after leaving the military, he was being recognized for service again, not for what he'd done in Iraq, but for what he'd been doing every day since. 2 years after Emma Peterson asked her innocent question, Frank Rodriguez was still delivering mail to the Maple Grove neighborhood, still walking the same streets with the same reliability and care that had characterized his 27 years of postal service. But something fundamental had changed in how Frank saw his work and himself. The story he'd kept private for 25 years had become a source of connection with other veterans, a tool for helping young people understand the value of service, and a reminder that heroism wasn't defined by single moments of extraordinary action. Emma Peterson, now 10 years old and in 5th grade, had learned an important lesson about the courage required to ask difficult questions and the power that honest conversations could have to transform relationships. "I'm glad I asked about your scars," Emma told Frank one morning as she walked part of his route with him. "I think everyone should know that you're a hero." Frank paused in his mail sorting to look at Emma. "You know what I learned from your question?" he said. "I learned that hiding parts of yourself doesn't protect you, it just makes you smaller. When you asked about my scars, you gave me permission to be proud of my whole story, not just the parts that felt safe to share." Emma nodded with the seriousness that characterized her approach to important conversations. "And I learned that heroes don't always look like heroes," she said. "Sometimes they look like mailmen who bring people happy letters every day." Frank smiled, understanding that Emma had learned something that would serve her well throughout her life. That the most important stories often belong to the most ordinary-looking people, and that the courage to ask difficult questions could reveal extraordinary truths. As Frank continued his route that morning, he reflected on how much his life had changed because one 8-year-old girl had possessed the courage to ask a question that adults had been avoiding for 25 years. The scars on his face would always be there, a permanent reminder of the day he'd pulled 7 soldiers from a burning helicopter. But they were no longer something he felt he needed to hide or explain away. They had become part of his story, not the most important part, but an important part of understanding who he was and how he'd learned to serve. Some heroes get monuments and parades, others get thank you notes from neighbors whose mail they've delivered faithfully for decades. Frank Rodriguez was both kinds of hero, but he preferred the second kind, because that's the kind that understands service isn't about being recognized, it's about being useful, being reliable, and being there when people need you, whether that's pulling them from burning helicopters or bringing them letters from the people they love. And sometimes, all it takes is one child brave enough to ask the right question to remind a hero that his scars tell a story worth sharing. This story was brought to you by Daily Soldier Stories. Have you ever had the courage to ask a difficult question that revealed something important? Share your story in the comments. And if this reminded you that heroes walk among us every day, subscribe to support the channel. Sometimes the most important conversations start with the questions we're afraid to ask.